It's interesting that the interest in the building is one of the forces that helped preserve the building, but also helped erode its truth. But that's where historic research comes in.
You're listening to Piper, the podcast where we decode healthy and regenerative design. I'm Beth Cochran. Let's travel back to the late 1800s to Tombstone, Arizona, a boomtown where gunslinging, gambling, saloon brawls, and shootouts like the gunfight at the OK Corral were the norm, where outlaws, vigilantes, and quote-unquote lawmen like Wyatt, Earp, and Holliday wrote the rules of frontier justice. It was where vice and violence met. It was the Wild West. At least, that's what the Hollywood myth-making machine and opportunistic local entrepreneurs would have you believe. And at the heart of all this legend and lore sits the Birdcage Theater. Built in 1881, using primarily adobe brick, by the way, this unassuming building has survived a lot and has somehow remained perfectly preserved. Its story, on the other hand, has been altered significantly over the years. And that's where Michael Paul comes in.
Yeah, it's a 19th century entertainment venue. That's the broad definition of it. But to narrow it down a little more specific, it's a relatively small building constructed out of adobe that's fairly well protected. And its identity is really linked to a lot of commercialized mythology today, which is maybe why the book was necessary.
From a young age, Michael developed a fascination with the American West, from its factual history to its mythical cinema. But how did a kid from Wisconsin form such a strong interest in the tiny town of Tombstone and the even smaller Birdcage Theater?
There was a movie in the early 90s that came out that had a little segment of it. Actually had a lot of history about the town in it, and this is back in the World Book Encyclopedia days. So I went back, watched the movie with my dad, came home and rated the encyclopedias. I was interested in the history of that town and whatever. So that was, kind of my on-ramp to the history of that place in a little more specific way. Not that I started my research then, but that's when the seed was planted.
But it wasn't until nearly 2 decades later that seed would start to develop roots and shoots, when Michael relocated to Arizona and finally got to visit the birdcage.
I'd actually never even been out here. I grew up in Wisconsin. I came here in 2009 and I went to visit the town shortly thereafter. And that was my first time. And it was immediately different from any place I'd ever seen before.
That visit and his near lifelong interest in history eventually evolved into a career built around excavating and conveying the West as it was, in all of its magnificent beauty and its harshness, its reality. As an art photographer, he has dedicated the last 10 plus years to capturing Western landscapes and wildlife, work that has culminated in a visual story of sorts titled Romance of the American West. And as an author and historical researcher, he has also spent the better part of 10 years researching the real story of the Birdcage Theater, which he writes about in his book, The Birdcage Theater, The Curtain Rises on Tombstone, Arizona's National Treasure. And spoiler alert, much of its legend is shrouded in fallacy. But beyond uncovering the real history of this iconic structure, Michael's research also revealed how the power of story can both preserve and erode a place, and how our built environment can become so much more than just an assemblage of columns and beams. They're time capsules of life, where story becomes nearly as important as the materials used in preserving them over the long term.
My interest in history found me volunteering at a few repositories, Arizona Historical Society and the city archives that were down in the town. And so by doing that, I was getting my first glimpses at historic records, which was mind-blowing to me. And it was beyond that, it was mind-blowing to me what these records contained and then also how you could utilize them. So that I found immediately fascinating, even without an interest in history. Almost like an investigation that would happen in modern times. You can use these different methods and these different ways of acquiring information that, when compiled, can come away with really firm conclusions. So that was pretty neat to me. And then the building itself, upon visiting it, it's, like I said, it really makes an impression on you. It's just different. It's so well preserved inside. There's a smell and a feel and a little bit of a static electricity in there that it just, in all the ways that humans can sense things, I feel like it's just different from other places. So that was really interesting to me. And a lot of the stories that were told, I found them fascinating, but they were contradictory. And so these contradicting stories brought up some basic questions of what's the truth? Now you overlay that with the ability to have some knowledge of historic records, maybe where to find answers. I kind of took it upon myself to try to find the answers. And just asking those few basic questions at the onset basically snowballed into a 10-year project, which was fortunate in that I found some really great original documentation that had never been used before when telling that building story. So that's really how I went from my first visit to being sucked into the vortex of this interest in revealing its real history.
It seems like so much effort has been put into preserving the mythology of it versus the truth.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think for the people that don't know that such records exist, I think that opened the way for some people to insert their own stories into it, not thinking that there was anything that could support or challenge that. It's kind of a cocktail. You look at old, especially really popularized history. It's kind of a shame that popularized history generally attracts the kind of attention that ultimately kind of redefines the truth of it. If you take another building in the state of Arizona that was built at the exact same time, you wouldn't have to wade through. The challenge to tell its real story wouldn't be combated by a lot of this mythology because there wasn't enough commercial interest in it or popular interest in it for that to happen. So it's interesting that the interest in the building is one of the forces that helped preserve the building, but also helped erode its truth. But that's where historic research comes in. And some people really, doesn't matter how much evidence you show them, the book is really just an option for people who do care to know what the truth is. They now have the opportunity to know it.
Where do you think the mythology started? Was it because of some of the movies, or did it start before that?
It's a couple of things. I know the exact answer to that. The more time that passes from an event, I think the more it tends to kind of stray from the truth, and the more times that story is being told, there's always a force that tries to tell the story in maybe a more trimmed up way, or a concise way, or a way that just is attracted to the romantic kind of lingo that might go along with telling a story. And so that took hold even at the turn of the century. It doesn't matter any kind of Old West history. The ways of life were really changing. Modes of transportation, the old ways of doing things became quickly romanticized. There's tons. It doesn't matter what industry it is. It doesn't matter if you were a cowboy, if you were an entertainer, if you were a freighter. At the turn of the century, there was a big wave of these memoirs being published, sometimes in small form, sometimes in formal book form, where people were recounting the ways of the old days. And there was a lot of people interested in reading about that. All of that became quickly mythologized. So there's a little bit of that at the onset. But as Tombstone came to terms with its potential for tourism, which happens relatively early in the 20th century, 1920s in there, when the Broadway of America went through that town. It made a big difference in 1926. But that's kind of when commercial interest was pumped into the town. Now, once that happens, now you're a little bit motivated to tell these stories. But there's a huge, as far as the birdcage is concerned, there's a huge ramping up of these mythologies in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And that's where the vast majority of the myths come from. Up until 1930, the building had been owned by a gentleman who actually came to Tombstone in 1880. And he loved the building. He was a former customer. So the truth of the building was fairly well preserved, I'd say, even up into his death, and his wife was alive until the early 50s. So despite the natural forces that would introduce these mythologies into such popular subjects like the birdcage or Tombstone, it resisted that pretty well. And so it's the 70s and 80s are really where it comes in.
What were some of the biggest myths that maybe even surprised you that you found untrue?
This is where I expected to get some pushback. Now, most of the book, I found so much primary source material that I wanted to give the voice in the book is more about what the building is, and not so much what it isn't. The book certainly isn't about breaking these myths down in that, but I do touch on them because as a complete work you need to have answers for that. Those are the first questions you would get. What about this and what about that? So with that said, I actually spent a lot of time to try to prove the myths right. So I wielded my researching skills trying to look for the places where a lot of these stories, if there was murders or if there were crimes, if there was prostitution, gambling, these things, there's hard records for every single one of these things. Now, it would have been very, very good for me if all these things happened to be true. I would love to have a book packed with them. But very quickly, these stories break down. There's stories told about murders happening in the building, and depending on who tells you the story, the number changes. Very infrequently do they give names and this sort of thing. But there's paper trail for all this stuff. I think people, when they think of the Old West, it's just this rogue society and civilization where anything happens and no one knows, and it's as unknown as what happened to the dinosaurs. But there's a lot of the government records that we have today that surround crimes and property exchanges and business activities through licensing and taxation. All of that stuff was available then. So fortunately, a lot of those myths weren't true. But in my attempt to prove them true, I actually found a story that was even better, which actually elevated the building's value even more. So it was ultimately a good thing.
How would you encapsulate like what you found versus what maybe you were expecting to find?
If we now the myths displace the truth. If we were to run that in reverse and we now displace the myths with the truth, the reality is that building is a cornerstone to the town. It is a direct link. Its very existence, its construction, is linked to the most violent period in the town's history. The fact that it's still standing links to the forces within the town to preserve and shift itself over from a mining economy to a tourist economy. It also is linked to some of the most prominent citizens that ever walked that town, and I don't necessarily mean the popular names of Wyatt, Earp, and Holliday. But it also links to an era in world history that is gone. It was the height of fashionable theater was these daily run theaters that hosted thousands of people, traveling the globe. That had kids that did the same thing. This building is really a monument to all of them. And once you get away with the myths, you understand the value of this building as it relates not to just the town, but the world outside. And I think that's something that is sorely covered up by the idea that it's just a place where, there were whores and murders.
You mentioned when you step into it, you feel this different energy. Mm-hmm. What do you think contributes to that?
There is just something different about it. I mean, the building's only 30 feet wide and 120 feet long. There's nothing really impressive about the arrangement of the interior, but it's so well preserved. I think a lot of people have probably stepped inside a building built in 1881, but how many people have stepped inside of one that, by virtue of the town's economy, had never been changed, had never been renovated, had been preserved? I mean, it's, you've got wallpaper and a drop curtain, you got, raw materials there that were installed by the people who were directly involved in its construction. It's just, there's very few layers of separation between you and that time period when you enter that building. And I think maybe that's the best I can articulate it, but that's just immediately obvious when you walk in, and it strikes you.
I've only been in it once, but I never knew if that was some of the original materials in it or if it was all fabricated.
Yeah, it had been renovated a number of times. It was operational as a theater for about 10 years, so it had been renovated several times. The building had been expanded once, and in the 1930s they ran it as a coffee shop once tourism was starting to hold. But the owners there, it's actually the gentleman who I mentioned earlier, owned it until he came to Tombstone in 1880, owned the building from 1906 until he died in 1930. His wife was still owning it at the time. She knew that it was his prized possession, and they went to great lengths to preserve. So the coffee shop, introducing that, was non-invasive in terms of its historic aesthetic.
How did the Birdcage Theater come to be?
Oh, now that's actually my favorite. Some of my favorite research revealed the answer to this question. You had the life cycle of that town. You basically have just a few scrubby miners on site there in 1878. Once the mines and once the ore proved long-term viability, the town really exploded. And so it went from canvas tents and maybe a few frame buildings to building and investing in permanent structures. But the awkwardness of that is that you had people on the ground there claiming that they owned lots. At the same time, a town site company was formed claiming that they owned rights to sell the lots. And so you had this dispute. If you came to town and you wanted to buy a lot, you wanted to buy it from the lot holder, you could pay the man for his lot, and then the town site company could come and say, no, you don't own it, I sold it to another party. So you could have two parties claiming ownership to a lot. Adding another twist on it, where the birdcage was, that part of town actually sat on top of one of the mines that was located before the town site was ever formed. So in this case, you've got a whole section of town. You've actually got 3 parties claiming rights to the lots. Now, the birdcage itself, built in 1881, came fairly late in the cycle of development of the town. By that time, there had been pretty much every convenience and amenity that a town like that would have. But that part of town also burned down in the middle of 1881, and so the birdcage was really built out of the smoldering ashes of that fire after this property ownership saga was unfolding. And there were hundreds of people that were taking their cases to court. Courts were bogged down. This put a pretty big holding pattern on each individual case. And people in a boomtown where you have time is money, like you've got to act fast, because a lot of these towns didn't last very long, and most of the people in town, this was their 5th, 10th, 20th time doing this, so there's a sense of urgency there. So no one wants to wait for courts. It leaked over to violence, people who were impatient, people trying to assert their rights, protect their property and their businesses, and not have anybody impugn their purpose for being there, which is to get on the ground floor, gain some wealth, and move on. So that building, the property owner ended up buying the lot 3 times. He went to court, he threw a bunch of money in. I mean, he spent way more money than he should have to get this going. But the fact that he did, the paper trail that was left by that, really indicated how much faith he had that that building would be financially viable. No one's gonna dump $30,000 into fixing a $5,000 car, that you think is going to die in 10,000 miles. But he had really strong faith, and I think the financial records support that. So the story of how it came to be, he had to dodge all of the legal obstacles and the violent obstacles. I mean, there's the mine owner that had that property. I mean, he's running around with shotgun guards, and his life was being threatened every day. Everyone talks about the gunfight there, but this is like a powder keg of violence waiting to explode with hundreds of participants on both sides. It's really very rarely talked about in the town's history, but it's all part of the story of how that building just even came to be. This is before they had one single transaction there as a business. So it's I think my favorite part of the whole building saga, just to get it built. 19th century variety theaters are really interesting. They had such incredible revenue potential. Like people were motivated to try their hand at the business who really had no experience. And depending on the, level of integrity of the person running it and maybe the nature of the town, some of these venues were run really, really well. Really ornate architecture, very expensive art being featured on the inside, and they featured some very high-priced entertainers. At the same time, anything that can be done well can be done cheapened, and you'd have people that would, put it up in really makeshift buildings that had rowdy patrons and were really sleazy. The entertainment was terrible, the music was terrible, and these were places that would encourage, some of the more seedy denizens of these towns to come in, and so the atmosphere was real rowdy. It was, but you had a lot of people think that these are, just for men, but a lot of these venues were. They would have matinees specifically for women and children. A lot of them would encourage families to come. So there's a wide spectrum of these variety theaters. And so when it came to researching the birdcage, the question was like, where on this spectrum from good to bad does this fall? And as it turns out, I spent 5 years investigating the performers, dug through thousands of pages of entertainment industry journals that would report on performers' comings and goings and where they were and how long they were there in real time. So I got these people's names, and I opened up a biographical file on I think I found 254 of them. So I opened up a biographical file on each one of them, and I spent 5 years digging through every single one of their lives. And these people were very good entertainers. They were pulled from venues that were very well respected, and a lot of them had careers that lasted sometimes in upwards of 40 years. So that's not an easy thing to do, to attract that quality of entertainer down to the Mexican border with a theater that's completely unproven. Pulling these people from these entertainment centers at the time, which were San Francisco and Denver and the East Coast, and even some from Europe and even some from Australia. To do that, you've got to have, I think, some pretty good industry acumen. And have some connections. So they were very well connected. It cost a lot of money, took a lot of effort to bring them. They could have just brought in anybody and turned it poor, but it wasn't. And I think that's one of the things that's important to understand about that building is, and then the owners themselves were, they were very well connected in the town. They rubbed elbows with the town's elite, the social elite. They were involved in church organizations, the local fire department. I mean, they were young people who were deeply invested in the town and the people there. And so I think the fact that they had a really upstanding business boded well for their standing in the community at the same time.
So what is the interior of the birdcage like? I know they had, some of the boxes, but was it multi-story?
Single story, pretty tall ceiling. The design actually there's nothing unique about it when you compare it to relative venues, other than the fact that it was smaller than most, which is really where its name comes from. But the construction of the building, it's mainly native materials. I mean, it's made out of adobe bricks, and for those that don't know about adobe, I mean, this is a material that they literally would just make out of the desert ground. It's a mixture of that, some grasses, and a little bit of water, sun-baked in the, for a day and stacked up. And there was an art to making those bricks, a process to make them so that they're strong, and then they're plastered to keep them away from the elements that could melt them like ice cubes in hot water. But then, they use some timber to reinforce it. There's a few metal tie rods. A lot of the building materials were dictated by the town. The fire that I mentioned earlier that wiped out that part of town, fire in these towns was a severe concern. These buildings are all touching, right? They all share walls. One building goes up and there's very little to stop it, even with a fire department. A lot of times they would stop these fires by just knocking buildings down to make a kind of a break wall. But after a few of these fires had happened, the town council decided to get smart. They passed an ordinance that within a certain area of the town, you had to build the buildings out of adobe, and it had to be a certain thickness. And so you wouldn't think like, well, there's regulations, there's building codes that we have today. You think like, well, the Wild West, people are just shooting each other and burying them in the desert, but they had rules, and it was for the benefit of the community, just like most rules are today. So that's kind of how the building's materials were dictated and how it was built. Went up pretty quickly within just a couple months.
That's amazing even by today's standards. We talked a little bit about the facades or the false fronts of kind of that period architecture, and most of the time they would do it to kind of hide a flimsy building.
I mean, you wouldn't spend a whole lot of money on the back half of the building. It's enough to house your millinery or your saloon. But the facade is where, and I suppose it kind of fits into Victorian standards or even standards today. I mean, how many people during COVID, when you were doing Zoom meetings, did you wear pajamas on your legs and wear something nice on the top? I mean, that's kind of the equivalent to what we're doing. We're presenting well, and a lot of these towns, they weren't thought to have a lot of permanence. So you would have kind of a, even some of them even had, in the transition period when the town was starting to build permanent buildings, the back half would still be canvas and frame before they passed that ordinance about fireproof materials. Those facades, in today's speak, we would say words like branding or marketing, but it was them fronting about the quality of what was ever found inside would be represented by the quality of maybe the architecture, the building materials, or the signage that would be out front. But birdcage its architecture. It's interesting. The most fascinating elements of its architecture are on the facade. Yet it's really just very tall archways and kind of dramatic doors, 3 doorways that open up across a 30 feet frontage, which was fairly common in. It certainly in Tombstone, some of the higher end buildings would have similar architecture to that. So it was kind of expected. And just being in the entertainment world, it's just, I'd say if you were to build your own retail store, people are going to kind of borrow maybe that Apple minimalist and have a lot of tables and a lot of shelves with few things out. That's kind of, I don't know, there's a trend to that. And the same thing was in the design of these theaters. I mean, it's only 30 feet wide, and its original footprint was even smaller than it is today because the back third of the building didn't exist. So you had to maximize what you could out of the building. So there was a bar up front. The arrangement of it today really reflects that. And he ended up adding, box seating. So it's a single story with 2 rows of boxes on either side. This not only gave a little bit better viewing, but it also allowed him to, actually allow more people into the building, which was already pretty cramped. But yeah, a lot of those were pretty standard features that you'd find in other theaters. Maybe it's just on some of those others were on a larger scale. But yeah, there's one performer, this young 16-year-old runaway from San Francisco, and she ended up performing the rest of her life and had a really prominent career in Europe, at the turn of the century. But she left some memoirs at early 1930s, 31, 32, and she remembered coming to the birdcage, and the first thing that struck her was how small it was. And I think if you were a person who patronized these types of venues in various towns and found yourself following the rush of wealth to Tombstone, that probably would have been the thing that impressed you as well. As I tracking a lot of these performers around and looking at similar venues in other towns, most of them were, I haven't found many that were as smaller than the one there. So, but they did a lot in such a small space, that's for sure. Yeah.
I'm just so curious where you did most of your research. Also, what were some of the most interesting artifacts that you found?
I did a lot of research in person. I did a lot on the computer. It's as time goes on, we get further and further away from these historic events, but by virtue of a lot of the records being digitized, we are in a sense kind of getting closer to that time because we have access to so much more material that provides answers. But a lot of stuff isn't digitized, for one, so you have to do some in person. But also I found, there's advantages and disadvantages to each. Like if say for example, you're trying to search for something in a newspaper and it's digitized, so you type in your search terms, through degradation, sometimes those search terms won't show up, so you might miss things. But on top of that, if you're just given, like you get a hit on it and you go straight to that little clipping and you get what you need, that's great, but you lose all the context. So if you have to scan through them in person and you've got to read through each sheet and scan everything, you're getting so much more information about what was going on, other factors. I mean, so much information I found was found incidentally while I was looking for something else in person. So majority of the research I did, at least concerning the town, was done at through their city records, which I used to volunteer at their archives. So I had access to a lot of those records. And then the county has a lot of records pertaining to, well, there's just different levels that you're going to find city and county. And then the state holds a lot of records that sometimes were at county level, sometimes were at state level, like court cases, testimony. You just never know what you're going to find in these. And it's, you go in looking for one thing and you get leads on 10 other things. But I also went out of the state. I found stuff really from coast to coast. In New York, I found stuff in Pennsylvania, I found stuff in California. I even found a few things that were in Europe and in Australia. But looking for those, it's once you would take the information that you do find and you compile it, and individual pieces of information are great. But the real strength is when you combine them, and it's like literally putting pieces of a puzzle together. One puzzle piece is great, but it doesn't show you what's on the puzzle, not until you start connecting it with the other ones. Well, once you start connecting enough pieces, it guides you where you should look next, or it might at least suggest it. And so you're just following that breadcrumb trail and reconstructing it as best as you can. And yeah, I wouldn't have believed that I found the stuff as widespread as I did, but you just, you let the records dictate to you where you look and what it all means. The favorite things that I found were actually things I was fortunately able to acquire. And one of them was a handbill, and in these theaters they would have printed out, daily or weekly, these advertisements that would have been roughly the size of, say, like a small or a modestly small restaurant menu. And just like a menu, it would tell you what's being shown at the theater every day. And it would do it in a real promotional way. It would try to get you excited about, say they had a favorite at the theater that was there for a couple of weeks. They'd make sure that you knew about it, and they'd advertise popularized plays and how much it cost to get in, and all that sort of stuff. But those are pretty rare. They're really meant to be thrown away. I mean, it's kind of like mass advertising mail that we get in our mailbox. That's a lot of that stuff, we don't save it. It's not printed on stuff that's even meant to last very long. So a lot of these handbills were disintegrated or thrown away. But I was able to find one. And the collector was willing to let go of it. Not right away. I just mentioned interest in it. It was a couple years later, and I was super excited to acquire that. And another one is all the businesses in Tombstone were regulated through a local licensing program. And just like today, you've got to pay your fees and submit your documentation. And that documentation can have a lot of useful pieces of information on it. So the one that Billy Hutchinson, the man who constructed the building and ran it for the first couple of years, he had applied for a city license. And so I was, again, through a private collector, was able to acquire that. He had it notarized and he had his signature on it. And so it's, I don't know, there's something kind of thrilling about holding a piece of paper that, has some stories to offer me, if it could talk. And it mentioned the date that he opened it, the first day he opened it for business. And so it's kind of an important document because it really is where the beginning of the legend of that building begins, with this piece of paper. So it's a real thrill to have it.
Why do you think it's so important to preserve the accurate stories of some of these pieces of architecture?
Our ability to appreciate anything, even things in our own lives, if we have a distorted view of what it is, I don't know that we can appreciate it the way that it's supposed to be. And I think as far as historic structures go, because they get knocked down all the time, and if people were able to appreciate it more, if there was more widespread recognition or awareness for that, I think there's the preservation efforts are directly linked to the levels of appreciation for things of the past. And as with any history, you don't have to have the artifact to appreciate it. The pyramids could not exist, and you could still perhaps appreciate what they were. But seeing them in person and being struck by the magnitude of them and really coming to terms with the incredible effort and engineering that took place there, I think would be lost a little bit. So it's like one hand washes the other. If you appreciate it more, you're going to want to save it more. And if it's saved, you can appreciate it more. And I think any history is worth knowing the truth of. I mean, just like in our own lives, if we distort things that happened in our past, we can't really learn the lessons that are valuable to us moving forward. So to me, it's all kind of tied together.
Well said. So what will people find in the book?
Well, I like to think that opening the cover of this book is like, going back in time. I mean, I put the words down, but the voice inside that book is pulled completely from these historic records that are, have been buried and been in darkness. And so they're really given a voice. And I wanted that to be the case. My favorite history books are ones where I, as the reader, feel like I'm really put into contact without a lot of interference what really happened. And the best way I could do that is do as complete a job as I could on the research so that the story was being narrated by these historic documents, not me. So when people open up the book, they're going to have an opportunity to maybe have their actual hands on the dirt and dust and the smoke and the sounds of what it was like then. That's important. We talked about appreciation, and hopefully that increases potential for people to appreciate what that time was like and what it was really like. Maybe not in the way that has been just caters to the popular notion of how it was. But they're also going to find, I actually arm wrestled with my publisher a little bit because I found so many crucial photographs and images. My initial manuscript had like 125 images, and when I submitted the manuscript, they said, we're going to do 40. I said, well, that's a little disappointing because I think a big value of the book is actually the images that you're seeing. There's been dozens and dozens, hundreds of books on Tombstone written, but I included images that had never been used in any of them. And they're really important to the actual supporting the text of the book. So cutting them out, I thought, was a real disservice to the reader. So by doing a little bit of fancy work, I was able to include, I think, 90 or so actual photographs of the original 125. So that's also something they're going to find. Heavily footnoted, there's 1,100 footnotes and a great bibliography too. And the bibliography is also an opportunity for people to read further because there's a lot of really, really good books out there that can maybe branch out even a little bit more.
Are there any more books in your future?
Absolutely, yeah. There's one related to this book. I mentioned the performers that I'd done research on. Some of these people's lives, I had gone down the rabbit hole on that so far that I have some of their biographies written. I had gotten in touch with a number of their descendants. I've got photographs of them. Their life stories are so incredible. And so each of their stories wouldn't be a book on its own. It would basically be a book that would include maybe 10 or 12 of their biographies, just to give a flavor for that time and what that lifestyle was like. Each of them walked through the doors of that building and until now have never even been recognized. Their names have never been known. And so here you're reinstalling this group of talented people into the building. But just even as a standalone, I think the book is a really thrilling. I love biographies myself, and it doesn't matter what time they lived in or where they lived. I just think the path of a human life in history is so fascinating, for the fact of like, it could be someone who lived 1,000 years ago, and there are things that are so fundamental about how we live today that you can relate to them. And then at the same time, they're going through things that are completely unrelatable, different ways of life. So I've always found that interesting. And so that's a book, and then there's a couple others. The research was so widespread, I would liken it to making a whole batch of cookie dough and rolling it out just to stamp one cookie out. So you've got all this extra material and all of that. There's so many books that could come from the completeness of that peripheral research. And I've got, as a creative, I combat the doing with the idea of doing. And so there's a couple other books in there too. I'll get to them sometime.
Knowing what you know now, would you want to be alive during that time period?
Well, yeah, I mean, my curiosity on a lot of that is because I have so many unanswered questions left from the research, and I think I would say yes to that just to put those questions to rest. Some of them I probably will never answer. I suppose if you're sucked into saying yes just out of the curiosity, and within your first couple days back there, you'd have your answers. Now you're stuck living there. And so the prevailing feeling at the time, just like we have now, we're living in a time where we have this expanding convenience, and things are constantly getting easier. And through technology, we have the old way of doing it is now shortcutted, and it's cheaper and it's faster. They had that same sense. So while it would be hitting the rewind button and all that for us, we still would have been living in a time where, in 5 years things are going to be easier. And then, from when that building was built, 25 years later, 30 years later, there were airplanes. People were traveling around cars. I mean, it's, so you were trending in that direction. So I think it would have been interesting.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with a friend or colleague, or leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast player, but only if you liked it. Let's keep spreading the word about healthy and regenerative design. Lastly, if you have an idea for the show or want more content about this topic, visit piperrepublic.com. Thanks for listening.